The Oregon Ducks are just 1 year into the Big Ten Conference, and they might be ruffling some feathers already and creating a little bit of a rivalry with the Big Ten's Big Dog. This is TSOW. Welcome to That Show Out West for That Team Out West, an unbiased, neutral observer's view of Oregon Ducks football. I'm Ted LaRue. We are 31 Saturdays away from this one until the defending FCS runner-ups make their way into Autzen Stadium to face off against the Oregon Ducks in the 2025 season opener. And whether it's 25 Saturdays or whether it's 15 Saturdays, 5 Saturdays, or just one Saturday, I'm excited to cover it all here, man, on That Show Out West. I've had so much fun in these 3 or 4 weeks since Oregon's season has ended, diving into the Ducks and having this Oregon exclusive show. It's been so much fun to really talk about this team. It's been so much fun to interact with all of you. Hey, if you're watching this show, make sure you like the show. Make sure you subscribe to the show. If you're listening, make sure you follow, you rate, and review on the podcast platform so this show can reach other Duck fans and more Duck fans just like yourself. Today, we are talking rivalries. There is a little bit of a budding rivalry within the Big Ten Conference, isn't there, between the Oregon Ducks and the Ohio State Buckeyes, and it is budding for multiple reasons, but I want to make sure I set the table before I get to that. And I need to set the table with the current status of Oregon Ducks football rivalries. Of course, we know the two rivalries that exist. The rivalries with the Washington Huskies and those pesky Beavers up north in Corvallis from Oregon State. The first thing and major point that I want to talk about when I talk about the current state of rivalries for the Oregon Ducks is, personally, I'm glad that this Washington game is in the spotlight of rivalry weekend at the end of the season, with, of course, the Big Ten move for Oregon and Washington to the Big Ten starting this season, and Oregon State and Washington State. Look, we know about the rivalry, certainly, with Oregon State, and let's call it as it is. They got a raw deal in this whole conference realignment thing, but with all of this, I think the positive, like I said, is that Washington game, which is the arch rivalry for both the Ducks and, of course, the Huskies. The Columbia River splits the animosity between these two programs up in Seattle and, of course, for the Ducks down in Eugene, Oregon. When you look at rivalries at the end of the season normally, that's the game that you really build up to. That's the game that you really want to win. That's the game against your arch rival that you wait through the summer months. You wait through fall camp, and you wait through the entire season, and you want to beat that team maybe more than anybody else. And I feel, especially in recent history, that has grown out of being the in-state rivalries for both Washington and Oregon, and it has grown into this game between each other. Since 2009, Washington and Oregon have a combined 25-6 record against their in-state foes. Now, with these two programs being Power 2 Big Ten programs, and Oregon State and Washington State kind of drifting back to the Power Six with what's happening in a rebuilt Pac-12, I think that gap is going to continue to widen, and it's going to continue to widen, and it's going to continue to widen. So having this highly anticipated matchup between two Big Ten programs, the two Big Ten powers in the Pacific Northwest, I think it's only a good thing, and I think it's only going to provide more shine in a national television window and provide a lot more national exposure for a rivalry that I really believe it's one of the more underrated and one of the more underappreciated rivalries in all of college football. Y'all know it. Let's focus solely on this Washington rivalry and where the status of this thing is with the Ducks and the Huskies. I think the transition from 2023 to 2024 tells a lot of the story for the Washington program historically, especially as of recent history, and the recent history, of course, for the Oregon Ducks. If you look at Washington from a historical perspective, they have very high highs, but they can also have very low lows as well. They have those peaks and they have those valleys as a program. Washington builds up to be really good teams in a smaller window. Of course, 1991, they had a national championship team. 2016, they had a team that went to the college football playoff. And of course, that 2023 team went to the national championship game. But for as much success as those teams had, you also have dropping down to 6-6 this past season. You also have an 0-12 season, whereas you look at the Oregon Ducks and the trajectory that not only that they've shown during the Dan Lanning era, but they've showed during other eras as well. This is a team that really doesn't drop off much from that 9-win level, from that 10-win level at a minimum, and especially in the Dan Lanning era. This is a team that is building a consistently great program. Whereas Washington, I think, can consistently build great teams maybe over a 5-year period, a 6-year period, and a 7-year period as well. So kind of coming back to this rivalry, I think because of that, there are going to be some lulls in the rivalry, like maybe there was this past season. I remember talking to some people that were in attendance in that game at Autzen Stadium in prime time this past season. They said it just didn't have the same pop. It just didn't have the same juice. Now, I also think a big reason for that is the previous two meetings in this series may have been the two biggest meetings in this series and the two best games in the history of this series. I think that, that recent history where you had such great competitive matchups on such a high scale certainly plays into this thing as well. But I think Oregon is going to be consistently a 9-win team. I think Oregon's going to be consistently a 10-win or more type of team that's going to be contending for college football playoff berths, that's going to be contending for Big Ten championships. That's nothing new that I've certainly said on the show before. But if you're looking at me, it's like, hey, do you think Jed Fish and the Washington Huskies are going to be a perennial 9-win team or 10-win team? I'm not sure if I would agree with that. So it's got a cause and effect where you're going to see some years where Oregon is going to have the performance like they did in 2024. I think that's just the status of this Oregon and Washington rivalry right now. But when Washington is up, this is going to be one of the more competitive games and must see and must watch games on rivalry weekend. Really glad that this thing is finishing off these regular seasons now within the Big Ten Conference. All right, let's talk about the series and the game against the Oregon State Beavers. I've talked to some people that are residents of the state of Oregon that have lived in the state of Oregon for a long time. Look, this Civil War game is very important to a lot of people within that state. And that's why this game is going to continue to be on the schedule in the month of September. But now with Oregon where they are, not only in the Power 2, but one of college football's best programs in a Power 2 conference, and then considering now where Oregon State is in a rebuilt Pac-12 in a Group of 6 conference, this already big gap between the Ducks and the Beavers is going to continue to grow and it's going to continue to grow big time over the years, certainly within this series. Oregon has won 14 of the last 17 games against Oregon State, and the Beavers have beaten the Ducks just 12 times in the last 50 years. So this is not something that's, hey, they're in the Power 2 now, they're going to be so much better, and Oregon State's going to be kind of down here. I know Jonathan Smith really built up Oregon State, and they had some competitive games and beat the Ducks certainly a few times during that period. But it was really going lopsided in favor of the Oregon Ducks, certainly before then as well, as we continue to play this rivalry in the month of September. It's going to lose some of its juice. It's going to maybe lose some of its luster from previous years. I think it's going to lose some of its intensity, maybe from some of its previous seasons. It just makes me think, what's going to happen when Oregon maybe beats Oregon State 10 years in a row? What's going to happen when Oregon maybe wins this 12 years in a row, 15 years in a row, something like that? I might be talking out of both sides of my mouth right now because of the way that Oregon and Boise State game happened early in the season, in the month of September, where Oregon needed a walk-off field goal to be able to get their very first win ever against the Boise State Broncos. But I think it's going to become so apparent that a top team in a conference like the Big Ten, a top team like the Oregon Ducks, and even a team like Oregon State, because I think now in this structure, if things certainly work out with the Pac-12, I think the Pac-12 could be in the running to get the group of 5 bid into the college football playoff. And I think Oregon State is going to be one of those teams that's going to be in prime position pretty close to every year to be in that position. But even when they're in that position, you see the discrepancy between these two teams right now. So if this kind of goes in the trajectory that I expect it to go, what's going to happen to the importance of this rivalry, the anticipation of this game on a year-by-year basis? If it goes 10, 12, 14, 15, maybe even more years than that Oregon State does not get a victory over the Oregon Ducks. There might be a year where everything kind of comes together and it's a senior-laden and loaded team for Oregon State, and Oregon might be going through a little bit of a down year, and the game might be in Corvallis at Reser Stadium, and all these kind of factors might be working against the Ducks. We'll see if that's a situation where Oregon State can kind of come out on top. But you can kind of see where I'm going with this, where this game is maybe going to have a little bit of the intensity certainly worn off as thing goes along. So you got this OSU game that maybe isn't going to have the same fire that it certainly used to. We know it's going to be important to residents and fans within the state of Oregon. But you got that OSU game, but maybe there's another OSU, I don't know, in your new conference where things are really starting to heat up, and that's where I really want to transition to right now. Oregon and Ohio State. This is a budding rivalry right now. If Oregon's first year in the Big Ten taught us anything, I think it taught us that this thing, it's got a lot of juice. This thing, it's got a lot of intensity, and I think we're just scraping the bottom. I just think we're on the surface right now. I think this thing is going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to grow, but we're going to certainly highlight the reasons why as this show progresses. Here's the thing about Oregon and Ohio State. Both of these teams have recent history, even pre-Big Ten. And this is a point why I think it's the biggest point why Oregon and Ohio State is budding maybe into the rivalry that it is. It's because these teams are meeting repeatedly in high stakes and high pressure environments. Let's start with their recent meetings. 2010, the Rose Bowl between two top 10 teams. Ohio State won that day 26-17 in Pasadena over the Oregon Ducks. Does it get any more high stakes and high pressure than a national championship game? The first ever 4-team playoff national championship game in January of 2015 saw the Ohio State Buckeyes win 42-20 over Marcus Mariota and the Ducks that particular season. But now this is where things really start to get juicy. Oregon's first ever victory over the Ohio State Buckeyes was in 2021. A Kayvon Thibodeau-less Oregon team that was pretty sizable underdogs going into Columbus to take on the Ohio State Buckeyes. You know, I think another big thing about a rivalry is that when something happens, especially if you're on the losing end to a specific team, you change something within your team that happened in that game, and it motivates you to try to make yourself better in a specific way. And I think that actually happened in this 2021 game. Of course, we all got to kind of go back into the Wayback Machine. Remember when the Oregon Ducks showed up into Big Ten country and played some Big Ten football when they ran it right at the Ohio State Buckeyes? C.J. Verdell, 20 carries, 161 yards, and 2 touchdowns that afternoon. Oregon rushed for not 1, not 2, but 269 yards on the ground against this Ohio State defense. This was the beginning of the end for Kerry Coombs as the defensive coordinator for Ohio State. I know a lot of people are going to look to that Michigan game in 2021 maybe as the true breaking point where the Wolverines were finally able to beat the Buckeyes, but I think this was the real eye-opener for Ohio State, and Oregon going into that environment and surprising a lot of people in that environment, I think. And then you saw what Ohio State did. Moving on to Jim Knowles after that season, yeah, their defense got a lot better, and I think it started with this 2021 matchup in Columbus. All of that pre-Big Ten stuff, it's all well and good, and it certainly provides a background and a backdrop for what Oregon and Ohio State is now. But Oregon's first year in the Big Ten and these 2 matchups against Ohio State went a longer way to maybe developing a Big Ten rivalry than certainly those previous meetings before Oregon was a Big Ten member. We're going to circle back to what we talked about at the beginning of this. Multiple high stakes and high pressure environments create the makings and the birthplace of a rivalry. And there were 2 pretty darn high stakes games and high pressure environment games this season between the Oregon Ducks and the Ohio State Buckeyes. Let's talk about them. Of course, everybody at the beginning of the season, they knew how good Oregon was going to be. They knew how good Ohio State was going to be. Everybody circled October 12th. Everybody circled that game at Autzen Stadium. And Oregon winning at that time felt like they made a crater-like indent on the college football earth at that point in time. The impact of Oregon winning that game was huge for Dan Lanning. It was huge for this Oregon football program to win a big-time game in a big-time spotlight against a big-time football team like the Ohio State Buckeyes in that specific instance. It really put on display how much of a home field advantage the Autzen Stadium crowd really is in that specific environment. And just like that 2021 game, which maybe set the table from Ohio State moving on from their defensive coordinator and bringing in someone like Jim Knowles and really improving their defense. Following Ohio State's loss to the Oregon Ducks, Ohio State really restructured what they were doing defensively, how they lined up, how they called their defense after that loss to the Oregon Ducks. It left an impact not only on the college football world with Oregon, but it also left an impact with Ohio State. That is now the second time we're talking about this in that specific series as well. And if you listen to Ohio State in kind of the lead up to that January 1st quarterfinal game, Will Howard said it and some other folks said it. They said, we wanted another shot. We wanted another crack at the Oregon Ducks. Now you see where this animosity is starting to build up a little bit when you have these high pressure games and these high stakes games. A lot of times the loser has maybe more effects off of a game like that than the winner certainly does. I think that fuel from that loss to the Oregon Ducks early in the season, of course, losing to Michigan, that provided, I think, a little bit of fuel certainly as well for that Ohio State team. But I think that fuel really propelled Ohio State to their best performance of the season on January 1st against the Oregon Ducks. That fuel propelled the rocket ship that was Ohio State to a 41-21 victory in the Rose Bowl. But that same fuel that was used on that football field is going to be used all offseason by Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks to motivate them for a 2025 championship run. These two matchups in 2024 kind of reminded me of an old school rivalry in the old Big 8 conference and why that eventually started to really build into one of college football's best rivalries throughout the 1970s, throughout the 1980s, maybe not as much in the 1990s, but Nebraska versus Oklahoma. Now, I know those teams played every year when the conferences were much, much smaller, and Oregon and Ohio State will not be playing every year, but I think there's some similarities between the two that can certainly ring true. When you look at why Nebraska and Oklahoma became such a big game over the decades and over the years with coaches like Barry Switzer for Oklahoma and Tom Osborne for Nebraska, a big reason was because the winner of that game between Nebraska and Oklahoma was going to win the Big 8 title. And whoever won the Big 8 would go down to the Orange Bowl. And whoever was in the Orange Bowl would have a pretty darn good shot to be in a position to win a national championship. Multiple high-stakes games. Year after year after year after year builds a rivalry. Having these type of high-profile games year after year after year, whether they're in the regular season, whether they're in the Big Ten championship game, whether they're in the college football playoff, no matter where they are, this thing is going to continue to build and this thing is going to continue to grow, just like Nebraska and Oklahoma did in decades before this game. But there's, I think, a word that we also need to focus on: decades. It's going to take a while before it certainly gets to that level. But for reasons that I'm about to lay out, I think Oregon and Ohio State are going to be in a position for this thing and the heat in this rivalry to certainly turn into a burning flame. You turn on the online community, and I think Oregon, you wanted to learn things about the Big Ten. I think they've learned firsthand, and I'm going to try to keep this brief, and I'm going to try to keep this short and not try to get myself into any trouble. But Oregon, I think you've learned something. I think you've learned what it's like to be in the same conference as the Ohio State Buckeyes fan base and just what that can bring you in the week leading up to a game. And if you fall short, what it can bring you in the days, weeks, and months maybe following said game as well. We've seen Oregon and Ohio State fan bases really start to heat it up on the online presence. And although it's what's on the field that certainly creates the rivalries, but when we're talking about as fans in the offseason, when you start to see these two fan bases really go at it, those are things where now these fan bases gets a lot more hyped. The environment is a lot more hyped when these two teams are playing against each other in a game setting. In order to have really good teams, to have some of these high stakes, high pressure type of games that Oregon and Ohio State played in 2024 and that they expect to play in 25, 26, 27, 28 and the near and distant future, you need to be able to put good rosters together. You need to be able to bring in good talent. And I think another reason, maybe it's certainly not the primary reason, but I think a pretty big reason why this series and these two teams are going to continue to see each other and they're going to continue to be able to compete against each other in high stakes and high profile football games is because no one in the Big Ten Conference recruits and acquires talent like the Ohio State Buckeyes and the Oregon Ducks. These are to borrow a phrase from Ohio State, these are the powers when it comes to bringing in the best talent in the country. And the more talent that you have on your roster, the more top 5 matchups you're going to have when you meet in the regular season, the more opportunities that you are going to have to play in a Big Ten championship game type of setting, the more opportunities that you're going to have to play in a college football playoff type of game. Over the last 3 years, Oregon and Ohio State have had the highest ranked classes of current members in the Big Ten Conference. When you see a top 5 or a top 6 or a top 7 final schools for a recruit, if one of these schools is in the race, a whole lot of times the other school is in this race certainly as well. And you have these recruiting battles. There have been some examples over the last few years where it has come down to the 11th hour and Oregon has been able to flip some guys over from Ohio State, which certainly adds a little bit of fuel to the fire as well. How about Jeremiah McClellan, the wide receiver that's expected to maybe step up and be an impact player this year? He was a signing day flip a couple of years ago. Ohio State thought they had a great 5-star corner duo in Devin Sanchez and Naeem Offord for this last 2025 class, but Naeem Offord did the old flip-a-rama on signing day, and he is going to be an Oregon Duck this season as well. And you've got Dan Lanning in Oregon going into the state of Ohio and getting a 5-star type of safety in Trey McNutt. These elite high school football players, they see each other at these campus visits. They see each other at these recruiting camps. They see each other all over the place. Some of these guys are going to go to Oregon. Some of these guys are going to go to Ohio State. You've seen some reaction from the Ohio State fan bases when one player was committed to Ohio State and then goes and flips over to Oregon. Just how much maybe there's built up there. And when they see each other again, they're going to want to beat that guy. And if they flip to a place like Oregon, they want to prove that their new home was the right decision for them. There is so much that goes into a rivalry like this. But it's one that I'm really excited to be able to see develop. I've been saying the term rivalry. It's certainly not a rivalry. We're just getting going. We're just scratching the surface with all of this. But as I laid out, high stakes, high profile environments, those big games, if they keep on playing them, Oregon does not play Ohio State in 2025. There's certainly a chance they could meet up in the Big Ten championship game. There's certainly a chance that they could meet up in the college football playoff. But then there's a return trip to Columbus for the Ducks in 2026. There's a chance that the Ducks and the Bucks could meet 4 times in 3 years. If that scenario plays out, I think we are well on our way to a Bucks versus Ducks rivalry becoming a much bigger thing in the Big Ten than it certainly is right now, where we are just in the beginning stages of this thing. Thanks, everybody, for watching TSOW today on the first day and the first Saturday of February. We got a lot more coming down the pike, but I'm Ted LeBrew. Thanks for watching That Show Out West.